We bought this house in 2020 in Vermont when Airbnb was all the rage. In this video, I'm gonna break down our investment over the last 3 years and watch to the end to see if it was worth it, our plans for the future, and my 2 big mistakes with this purchase. So to start, here's what I loved about the place. So for one, it was listed as a single family, but it was actually 2 units because there was a fully finished barn in addition to the main house. And the main house had kind of like a homey feel where the barn was more rustic. So we felt like it appealed to kind of 2 different audiences, which we loved in a property. The next thing I loved is that this area has 3-season short-term rental demand, meaning that people are coming in summer, fall, and winter, and spring is really the only prolonged period of downtime, besides maybe a month or 2 here and there, like November. And the town it's in it's called Manchester, and it's just a picture perfect Vermont town. It's nestled in the Green Mountains with outlets and shops and outdoor activities. And for those people that don't like to get outdoors, there's an incredibly good food scene. So it really had a lot going for it for a small town. And lastly, it's drivable from Boston and New York City within 3 hours. So it's fairly accessible for a vacation destination. So we bought it in January 2020 for around $510,000, and that was down from the listed price of $550,000. And it was actually kind of funny when we were closing on it because it was like the depths of COVID, and to close, our attorneys literally had to be parked side by side with cars in a parking lot outdoors, and we had to slide our documents through like cracked windows while masked. It was pretty crazy, and glad we're not in those times anymore. But anyway, we took advantage of great mortgage terms at the time, and we worked at 10% down, 2.8% 30-year fixed. And so with taxes, PMI, and insurance, our payment came out to like $3,000 a month. So you add in about $15,000 in minor renovations and furnishings, which by the way is super cheap for an Airbnb, but we were luckily able to work in the purchase price a lot of furniture, so that kind of saved us on the expenses end. So our all-in amount came out to about $66,000. Now let's take a look at how our first year turned out. So since we bought in January and the place was pretty much ready to go, we basically had a full year of rental revenue on the books, and the demand was incredible, just as you would have expected in 2021. So for year 1, we were looking at gross revenue of about $115,000. We had property expenses of about $47,000, and this was mortgage, taxes, insurance, things like that. And we had Airbnb operating expenses of about $32,000. So this is for cleaning, supplies, and utilities, because we do have to include those with the Airbnb. So that came out to a net profit of about $36,000 in year 1, which equated to a 53% cash-on-cash return just for the first year. So this is obviously like a pretty incredible return, but it wasn't unexpected because we actually had 3 other short-term rental units before purchasing this one, and we had seen even better ROI in those. So this is kind of what we were expecting with this purchase. But everything up to this point was great. But going on to the next couple years, things definitely started to change. And unfortunately, at this point, it's hard to go back. So we had high hopes for 2022 since 2021 just killed it. Going into the year, we thought we'd at least see about a 30% bump in revenue since last year. We had to fit the place up, we had to build out our systems, we had to wait for reviews to compile and things like that. So going into 2022, we were ready to let it rip, but it just didn't pan out as great as we thought. And the numbers came out to gross revenue of about $108,000, which was just about on par with 2021. Property expenses were $38,000. Airbnb operating expenses were a little lower at $25,000 because we had a little lower volume, and those are variable. So that equated to a net profit, $45,000, which would have been a 68% cash-on-cash return in that year alone. It's a running cash-on-cash return of about $81,000, or a 122% running ROI. Because at this point, we hadn't put any more money into the property in terms of significant renovations or furniture purchases. So it's really just our revenue divided by what we had put down initially of that $66,000. Now, you would think at this point we were feeling like we crushed it, but in reality, we could kind of just like feel that the market was shifting. I think by now word was getting out that these returns existed and people were just kind of flooding the market because it was kind of an easy thing to do at that time. There was just way more volatility and some months with barely any revenue, which we hadn't seen before, even in our other Airbnbs, which we had run for years. So we actually ended up renting the main house on this Vermont property for the last like 3 months of the year, just to kind of like hedge some of that volatility and lock in some revenue. So heading into 2023, we were definitely prepped for a down year just based on the trends, and we definitely got one. So planning ahead really helped us manage our expectations. And the 2023 numbers came out as follows. So gross revenue was $87,000, so it was down about $20,000 from last year. Property expenses were $36,000, so those are stable, thankfully. And our Airbnb operating expenses were $22,000, and those were down because our bookings were down, which are variable with bookings. So our net profit came out to about $29,000, which would have been a 44% cash-on-cash return in that year alone. The running cash on cash is now 166%, which is great, but you can see how this is trending and like why this might be concerning. So throughout 2023, we had to pull out all the stops as well. Like we had to utilize promotions, we had to go to direct bookings, added new furnishings, better pictures, etc., just to keep those bookings coming in at a somewhat acceptable level. And what's more, I did an analysis where I stripped out all the expenses related to Airbnb and I just took a look at what we would have made if it was long-term rented at market rates. And it came out to be a net of about $26,000. So that means we did all this extra work for Airbnb just for an additional $3,000 on the year, which really was not worth it for us. It's important to note that even though short-term rentals are technically considered to be in the real estate sector, you're really in the travel industry, which is just much more volatile and economy dependent, meaning you'll get these huge upswings when things are good and then huge downswings when things aren't so good. Compare that with long-term rentals, which have very little volatility. And if you ask me, if there's not at least a 20 to 30% premium on my short-term rentals, I'm opting for long-term rentals all day. It's just way easier. So heading into 2024, we're in a tough spot with this because I don't want to run it as an Airbnb if I'm making barely above what it does long-term. And the sales market is pretty stagnant with rates being high right now. So it's looking like this would just be kind of a hold as an Airbnb for the time being. We're going to try to rent it long term, and if that doesn't happen by the time the market improves, we're really just going to have to sell it and try to take whatever equity we can get out of it. But the final phase of this investment is very much TBD, so make sure to subscribe to the channel because I'm going to be doing a follow-up on it at some point, and I'm going to let you know how it all turned out. And what's most frustrating is I have access to Airbnb data and I know that there's other places with high occupancy making great money. And from a quality standpoint, our place is actually pretty good. We have 4.9 stars on both units on the property. So our listings are doing pretty exceptionally. So the drop off in activity is even more confusing, but after thinking about this for a while, here's where I think I went wrong. So the first thing I did wrong is I looked for properties with multiple units because I knew the demand was high. So I wanted to amplify my return by having multiple units. But as the market shifted, I think these types of multi-unit properties just weren't as desirable as those true single-family vacation properties. And two, I didn't focus on super high-end finishes or like newly renovated properties because demand was so high. I just aimed for our places to be like budget nice. So basically I was aiming to be better than like 80 to 90% of the listings out there. And at that time, if you achieve that, you were getting booked consistently for good money. But now in 2024, it feels like it's those top 10% of places that are getting all the consistent bookings and the good money. And if you don't have one of those places or you don't have great reviews, there's just some serious volatility and declines in occupancy. So was it all worth it? I can't really say that 166% ROI wasn't worth it, but definitely feels like we rode this roller coaster up and now we're kind of on the way down, as you can kind of see in the financials. So to sum it up, yes, I'm glad we did it when we did it, but I wouldn't try it in this current market because with interest rates so high, there's so much less room for error. Lastly, I know there's been a ton of hype about this AirbnbBUST that's going to sweep the nation as more operators feel the pain like I am, but I just don't agree with it on a broad level. I think there will definitely be more sales due to oversupply and more competition, but it's going to be isolated to either areas that have fallen off for travel, or if you're a bad operator in those good areas, you're going to struggle to get bookings. There's still great markets to have Airbnbs, and if you don't make my mistakes listed, I still think there's some room for new investments and some money to be made, but you really got to be careful in this market. If you like content like this, at Roam Rich, we're digging into all things financial intelligence, including real estate pieces like this. So make sure to subscribe to get our fresh content. Leave any feedback or questions in the comments, and I'll make sure to get to it. Thanks for roaming with us.